Functional groups are some of the most important parts of biological molecules that we'll ever encounter in this class. They're so important that it's almost impossible to see a biological molecule and, once you know the functional groups, not try to identify the functional groups that are part of that molecule. In general, functional groups are parts of molecules that are chemically reactive. In other words, they're the parts of the molecules that are going to combine to form chemical bonds with other molecules. So think of it as the spot at which chemical bonds will form between two or more different molecules. I showed you this slide in class, and this slide summarizes the different types of functional groups that are found in biological molecules. We'll take each of these functional groups one by one on the next few slides and try to describe not just their formulas, but also some of their chemical properties and the types of biological molecules that these functional groups are found in commonly. So let's start with both the hydroxyl and carbonyl groups. Specifically, the hydroxyl group is the OH group, and you can see that here. This OH group is polar. Remember, just like in water, the oxygen pulls the electrons towards itself more so than the hydrogen can pull back, giving the oxygen a slight negative charge and the hydrogen a slight positive charge. Thus, there is a polar covalent bond between that O and that H. So the hydroxyl group is certainly polar, and we're going to find hydroxyl groups as part of alcohols. Think ethanol, for example. Think of the Lewis structure of ethanol, and I bet you can identify a hydroxyl group. And we're also going to see it as part of carbohydrates. There are other functional groups that are shown in this molecule. Both of them belong to a class of functional group known as the carbonyl group. And the carbonyl group comes in two forms. The first form, probably the easiest form to understand, is the keto or the ketone group. Okay? The ketone group is always going to be a carbonyl group and will always be represented by a carbon double bound to an oxygen, which is then single bound to usually two other carbon atoms, and that makes this a ketone group. Okay? Aldehydes are different. They're still classified as carbonyl groups. They're still going to be a carbon double bound to an oxygen. That carbon that's double bound to the oxygen will also be bound to a carbon, but then will also be bound to a hydrogen atom, and that makes this functional group an aldehyde group. And we can see that here. In the case of the ketone, here's the C, here's the O, and then here's the C. In the case of the aldehyde, here's the C double bound to the oxygen. That carbon is single bound to this carbon, and then this carbon is single bound to that hydrogen. Both of these functional groups, both the ketone and the aldehyde group, are polar, but we need a slightly different way to describe why these functional groups are polar. We said before that if we had oxygen as part of a polar covalent bond, that the oxygen would pull the electrons towards itself more so than the hydrogen could in the case of the hydroxyl group. Well, in the case of the ketone group, the rules still apply. This oxygen pulls the electrons more closely to itself than does the carbon. Okay? And we can use the same rationale to explain that phenomenon. Oxygen has more protons than carbon. Okay? So this oxygen would have a slight negative charge. That carbon would have a slight positive charge. Okay, similarly, same logic applies to the aldehyde group. In the case of the aldehyde group, we still have the C double bond O. Okay, so we're still going to have a slight negative charge on the oxygen. We're still going to have that slight positive charge on the carbon, again, because oxygen has more protons than carbon. Thus, we have a polar covalent double bond between this carbon and that oxygen. Okay? In general, whenever you see an oxygen atom bound to another atom of another element, especially one of our 6 elements, that bond is going to be polar covalent. So let's move on to the next example of a functional group. The next example is a carboxyl group. The carboxyl group can be shown or can be seen here. Okay, it's a carbon atom double bound to an oxygen. This carbon atom is then bound to a second oxygen atom, and that second oxygen atom is bound to a hydrogen atom. Now we got to be careful here because it looks at first glance that what we have here is a carbonyl group and a hydroxyl group. But we really don't have that. Remember that in the case of the carbonyl group, this carbon atom was bound to two other carbon atoms or a carbon atom and a hydrogen atom. At no point was this carbonyl carbon bound to another oxygen atom. So this is a special type of functional group. Again, it's the carboxyl group. Okay, we're still going to have polar covalent bonds, not surprisingly. Here's that C double bond O again, so we know partial negative on the oxygen, partial positive on the hydrogen, on the carbon, partial positive on this hydrogen, partial negative on that oxygen. Okay, so polar covalent bonds hold together all of the atoms in this functional group. Thus, this functional group is, of course, going to be polar, and we're going to see this functional group in fatty acids and amino acids specifically in terms of the biological monomers that will give rise to some of the more complicated biological polymers that we'll encounter over the course of the semester and over the course of the year. Our next functional group is the amino group, and the amino group, as shown here, is the NH2 group. Okay, and this functional group is also polar, but it's going to be polar for a reason similar to what we've seen before, but not exactly the same. This nitrogen atom, much like the oxygen atom previously, has more protons than the hydrogen atom. Consequently, the nitrogen atom will pull electrons towards itself more so than the hydrogen atoms, making the bonds that hold together this amino group polar covalent. So the amino group, like the carboxyl group, like the hydroxyl group, like the carbonyl groups, are all polar. We'll see the amino group as part of amino acids, but for right now, I want you to be familiar with the idea that if you see an amino group, that the amino group will instill polar properties on the molecule as a whole. All right, we're almost done. Just two more functional groups left. The next functional group is the phosphate group. Okay, and the phosphate group is going to be described as a PO4 2- group. Now we've seen a PO4 3-, that was the phosphate ion that hopefully you remember from just last week. This is a little bit different because in the case of the phosphate group will be attached to another biological molecule. In this example, it's a little oversimplified. The phosphate group is attached via this oxygen atom to a hydrogen atom. But it doesn't have to be a hydrogen atom. It, for all intents and purposes, could be a carbon atom attached to this oxygen atom. Okay? What's left over from the phosphate group is an oxygen here and an oxygen here, and we can see that each of those oxygens has a negative charge, and here is a phosphorus with a double bound oxygen atom attached to it. So that's the phosphate group, PO4 2-, because again, the phosphate group is going to be attached to some other atom, or ideally a larger biological molecule. Same logic as before though, this phosphate group is definitely going to be polar. We have our partially negatively charged oxygens, and we have our partially positively charged phosphate. So just like in the case of a hydroxyl group or an amino group, this functional group will also instill polar properties on the larger biological molecule, and we're going to see phosphate groups as part of the structure of nucleotides and eventually as part of the structure of a molecule called ATP, but more on that in a future video. All right, last functional group, the sulfhydryl group, and I save this for last really because we're not going to see it very often. The sulfhydryl group, as you can see here, is an S bound to a hydrogen atom. Okay, and we really only see sulfhydryl groups in amino acids and consequently proteins. And specifically, we're only going to find sulfhydryl groups in two types of amino acids. One of them is the amino acid methionine, and the other is the amino acid cysteine. Okay, so it's the only two places that we're ever going to see sulfhydryl groups. Like before, this is a polar group. In this case, it's even going to be more obvious. We have a sulfur atom with a much, much larger number of protons compared to this hydrogen atom, so that sulfur atom will have a slight negative charge, and the hydrogen atom will have a slight positive charge. Okay, and that's the sulfhydryl group. Later on, we'll see that these sulfhydryl groups that are part of the amino acid cysteine in particular can actually form their own type of covalent bond called a disulfide bond. You can see that right here. And this disulfide bond, again, is a covalent bond that will act to hold two amino acids together that are part of a single protein polymer. So those are your 6 functional groups that you should be familiar with as we venture into the world of biological chemistry. And as I tried to show you in class, it's these functional groups that actually will react with each other to form new chemical bonds as monomers link together to form polymers. So I believe I showed you this example in class where you've got a hydroxyl group and then a second hydroxyl group in each of these 2 carbohydrates. We know that in the case of condensation or dehydration reactions that the water will leave as the new chemical bond between the monomers forms. Okay? But since functional groups are the parts of the molecules that react, we can see here that it's these 2 hydroxyl groups that are going to react to form the water and the new chemical bond between the 2 monomers. Last slide. We can also follow the same logic in the case of a dipeptide or a biological molecule where 2 amino acids are linked together. What you see here are 2 amino acids, and I bet you can identify some of the functional groups that are part of these amino acids. Hopefully here you can see now that we have a carboxyl group and we have an amino group. Okay, we can see that one of these carboxyl groups has an OH. Remember, it's not a hydroxyl. The amino group has a hydrogen. Those parts of the functional groups can combine to form water. And what's left over? Well, it's the chemical bond between the 2 amino acids, which in this case is known as a peptide bond, that will permanently link those 2 amino acids together until, of course, a hydrolysis reaction comes around to separate them back into their constituent amino acids. So that does it for functional groups. I hope this helps you kind of see not only the structure of the functional groups, but some of the chemical properties as well, and why these groups have those chemical properties, and also give you just a slight taste for where we're going to find these functional groups in the biological molecules that we encounter over the course of the year.